Now, if I may come to a couple of other points that were made, do you know, everyone says that Africa, they talk about it as one continent, but when you read through your book, I mean, Windhoek to northern Mozambique, where you were with the Chinese farmer, to places in West Africa. What's yours? I mean, how would you respond to people who say, you know, who seem to think that this is one continent? You called it Balkans in a way. How would you, how would you distill that?
Well, it's one of the great handicaps of Africa to be so balkanized. I mean,
Yes.
I think that's the best word to describe it. 54 countries, or some, depending on your definition. This means that Africa doesn't have the easy opportunity of very large and consolidated markets, with very few exceptions. You know, Nigeria is a very big market. Ethiopia is becoming a very big market. Kenya in the future will be a big market. Kenya is a relatively large country. But most African countries are not very large. And you know, so you have the replication of systems and of costs from one place to another. That is just a huge. People talk about, you know, the ethnic feature of randomly drawn borders around Africa, but that's not as big as the economic cost, I don't think.
The barriers, you mean.
The barriers, right? And the depth. So you've got if you have 54 rent-seeking classes, that's worse than having one rent-seeking
Yes.
class, right? You know, you're replicating these costs and structures from over little Togo, Benin, even Ghana is a fairly small country. You know, Gabon, Congo Republic. These are tiny places. Each of them has, you know, a firmly entrenched, you know, class of people who are skimming lots of stuff off the top. And each of them has this, you know, they'll be going to Washington, each of them with 40 or 60 or 150 different people in the
That's
delegation, right?
Yes.
You know, this gives you an idea of the replication that I'm talking about. But, you know, Africa is spoken about, unlike any other continent, as one. We don't say something happened in Asia today.
No.
We don't say something happened in Europe today,
No.
or something happened in North America today, or South America
That's a
today.
good point.
We, meaning the media, only speak about Africa in these terms. And this is another kind of handicap to
It is.
Africa. Not only has the outside world, meaning the European imperial experience, colonized and balkanized Africa, but it has refused subsequently to accord any kind of individual specificity of attention to Africa. And so you get Africa spoken of as Africa, as opposed to something happened today in Tanzania or something happened today in Senegal. You know, there's an Ebola crisis in Africa.
Yes.
You know,
Is it a big crisis, or is it?
actually, it's not a big crisis.
Oh.
No. But it allows, you know, people to speak about Africa in ways that are resonant with lots of old habits
Yes.
of danger and of
Diseases
you know,
we don't understand.
things being, you know, contamination and infection, and you know, these are quite
So
persistent
funny. Yes.
storylines
No,
that
you're right.
that exist.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh.
No, but I mean these have long lineages. These kinds of story ideas of, you know, these dark, dangerous things emanating from Africa, and so Ebola really fits that. Even though, I mean, it's a tragedy for the 700 or so people who have died from it, but
Yes.
it's 700 people. You know, I don't know the numbers, but I would wager that 700 people have died of malaria in the last week. You
That's
know,
right.
Easily, right? But you know, malaria is not making its way to the West, and it's not new, and so it doesn't fit this kind of storytelling penchant that you know is so much alive in terms of the way the media relates to Africa. Ebola is not a big deal at all.
Talking about the way the media relates to Africa, what I think is interesting is with what you're talking about, technology and social media. I mean, given the amount of conversation that's now bubbling under on the continent by Africans, do you think that's changed that dynamic at all, or you don't?
It has a great deal. So it's allowed a number of things to happen. It's allowed conversations to take place among Africans across borders that never took place before. So anybody who follows, who's really active in Twitter, who has a lot of African sort of conversations, will be aware that, you know, you have people chiming in from Kenya and Zambia and Ghana and Nigeria and Ivory Coast and here and there, even across European language groups. There's enough people who can speak a common, you know, degree of English that they'll want to chirp in. This never happened before. You know, Kenyans and Nigerians never spoke about anything commonly before. You have this conversation taking place via social media that has united Africans intellectually, topically, conversationally in ways that just, you know, were unconceivable previously. Another thing that's happened that's really interesting and important is that it has allowed, so one of the threads of this kind of conversation is a thread of response to the way the West talks about Africa.
Yes.
And so you have a kind of critique of the Western discourse on Africa that's taking place via, there's blog sites like, Africa as a country. And, and there are many individual sort of self-appointed critics on Twitter who say, look at this ridiculous thing that we're seeing in the New York Times or in the Guardian or wherever, and did they ever think to talk to an African, or did they ever think about this or that aspect of what they're reporting on? How unreal is this? This is a new feature. Where I think this all leads to, and where I'm hopeful about the power of social media in this regard, is that it may lead to something that has never really existed previously in history, and that is a kind of media discourse from Africa about Africa that has a continental purview. So there's Kenyans who've always talked about Kenya, and there's Congolese who've always talked about Congolese, but there has never been any real substantial body of Africans who have been able to sustain a conversation among themselves, an informed conversation among themselves about Africa. And there's not much African media about Africa. Some, African intellectuals, and I understand the frustration here, they speak about the need to sort of tell our own story and have our own conversation about Africa. That's never really been possible before. Social media and the internet, not just social media, but the internet, meaning internet-based publishing, is creating the possibility of having African audiences for material written by Africans, for reporting driven by Africans for the very first time. And I think social media becomes a sort of a catalyst that helps jumpstart this. And I'm very hopeful that in the next few years, we'll see lots of interesting publishing ventures in Africa that for the first time can really sustain African conversations and have a truly African perspective.
You're doing some work at the Multimedia University, aren't you?
That's correct.
Yes. And is that looking at this sort of area?
So one of the things we want to do at the Aga Khan new Graduate School of Media and Communications is create programs in entrepreneurial journalism where we train people to think about the opportunities that technology presents to get away from old cost structures. It's very expensive. We have an expression in the United States, it's almost a cliche, that the only freedom of the press exists for people who can afford to own a press, right? But in the internet age, you don't have to buy a press. You don't have to print newspapers. And so if you can create a certain kind of entrepreneurial spirit and know-how among a young cadre of African journalists who have a kind of spark and intelligence and curiosity and drive in them, we've seen a revolution of the media landscape in the West already in terms of very, capable and vibrant competitors of the old sort of legacy media groups of the West. Newspapers like the New York Times that I come from. Right. There are all kinds of media companies that now compete in terms of dominating the conversation and national conscience in the United States and in other Western countries, that never had to sort of hire 500 people and have a printing press and all the rest. And so this is a moment of opportunity for Africa to kind of go down that road. And we in this school, the GSMC of Aga Khan University, we'd like to play a small piece of a role in that.
That's exciting.
Just as a catalyst, as a training ground.
If I'm, of course, in the economics field, so I'm interested to hear what you were saying about the economy. I think in an article today or yesterday, you were either quoted or you were writing saying what the Chinese saw was not only natural resources. You said they saw a potential market, and you had a high call number of 3 billion consumers. That's right. So looking at that landscape, we overlaying the natural resource story on there. What are the countries, because you've been now involved in the continent for more than 30 years, what are the countries that, from an economic point of view, if you tell me, imagine I'm going to look after your next $100,000, where would you send me on the continent?
Well, so our image of Nigeria is very often a negative one. I mean, there are cliches and stereotypes of Nigeria of being very chaotic and poorly run and even violent place, given Boko Haram and all the rest. I think of Nigeria as a place of just limitless possibility. I mean, it's first of all, it's one very large market that's growing very fast. But it's also a country that's growing, that economically is growing very fast. And although it's by reputation an oil economy, most of Nigeria's growth is not oil related. It's services related.
Yes.
And manufacturing related. And so Nigeria is a place that if I were to, you give me $100,000 and say you're free to invest this anywhere in
Yes.
Africa, that would be one of the first places I look. So I would extract from that a rule that would sort of guide my subsequent prospecting.
Yes.
And that is, unless you find some special opportunity, and you're an investment pro and I'm not, so you could go to a small country and find some unique opportunity
Sure.
based on, as you said in our earlier conversation, just the inefficiency of markets. The world doesn't really know in real time what's really happening in so many places. You can
Yes.
unearth a gem somewhere
That's
that has been
right.
uncovered by other people.
Yes.
I don't have that opportunity as readily, certainly. So I would look for big markets.
Yes. So Nigeria would be your top one.
Nigeria would be my
So that
top
chimes
market.
with majority of people feel the same way.
Yeah. Ethiopia would be
Yes.
another. I mean, I would look for the demographic giants of Africa.
Have you been to Ethiopia lately?
Yes, I have.
Did you go in the book? I don't think you did.
No, I didn't. But
No,
I went
that's
during
right.
the research for the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, when I look at things like internet statistics, if you look at Ethiopia, internet penetration is something like 2%. If you look at somewhere like Kenya, it's about 57%. Isn't that going to hold back Ethiopia in the future? Or you think the model works in this type of moment?
I think that Ethiopia is making great strides right now for reasons that are related to the way that China has been able to take off. In other
It's a
words,
similar structure.
no, well, so here's the thing. Most of what's happening in China over the last 30 years is not because the Chinese Communist Party has come up with brilliant policies. It's because there were disastrous policies in place for so long previously. So the most important thing has been stopping doing all the disastrous things.
Yes.
And not coming up with the great new ideas necessarily. China has had some good new ideas. Ethiopia has had some good ideas. But this isn't the main feature taking place. The main feature is stop doing the really, really horrible and stupid things and give people an opportunity to make money, and they will. And so that's the major feature of why China has taken off, I believe, and why Ethiopia has recently done so well. How far Ethiopia, and indeed how far China can go, though, will depend on bigger questions.
Yes.
And this gets into...
We were touching on that. Why don't you mention what you thought were the bigger questions?
Well, so just to finish on Ethiopia, I mean, I think that, and this relates to China, that there's, that a top-down, highly centralized, control-oriented national policy, I think in the long run probably won't serve Ethiopia terribly well. And so right now things look quite good, but to answer your 2% internet penetration rate problem, I think relates to this. That the Ethiopian state is probably not terribly keen on making sure that everyone has access to the internet and that people can have free and free-ranging conversations on the internet. That inhibits their control.
Yes.
They would like to be tightly in control of many things.
So you see it as a very similar scenario to what we have in China.
Absolutely. This limits opportunity, and I think the Chinese have begun to understand and are wrestling with the notion of how do you simultaneously relinquish control in social and economic ways, or I should say economic and social ways, and retain control politically. The Ethiopians haven't figured. They're at a much earlier stage in this conversation.
That's not
Right.
It's how to get the economic growth going.
Exactly.
Yeah. So those two are for you the sort of lodestars, the ones that you look out for.
For sure.
And from an opportunity-wise, from what you've seen, because the experience you gained, I mean, you met all kinds of characters doing all kinds of businesses. I mean, I was quite taken aback at the sort of things, in particular, the Chinese were prepared to do. One guy had sort of gone and got himself some land in Mozambique. You had another sort of factory maker. Looking at those businesses, how have they managed to do so well and become so Are they working harder? Are they better at business? What are they doing? They're plugged into China where they're getting some advantage?
So part of it is that they have networks that go back to China, and China is producing goods, manufactured goods, and providing credit in ways that help the Chinese entrepreneur who comes here
Yes.
outcompete other rivals.
Because Howard, I met this Chinese ambassador who told me, Ali Khan, when our contractors do a project for the government, they can come to us and present the cost, and we will pay them, and we'll go and collect from the government. Correct. And given the credit issue in Africa, this seems to me to be a competitive advantage of Michael E. Porter territory.
Huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Chinese state is providing credit.
Yes.
For anything of any size that's taking place involving China and Africa. A lot of the characters in my book are individual entrepreneurs, and so they're not
They were more individualistic than
they're not
state.
taking state credit to do their thing. But bigger players are getting state credit, and it's quite cheap, and they get, as you said, the backing of the state. So if there's a collection problem, the Chinese embassy will go after. They'll
That's
put
right.
they'll put the squeeze on the Kenyan government or whoever the government is, and say, look,
Yeah.
we're doing all this stuff for you, and you're not paying. Other kind of outside competitors, whether it's in the United States and Europe or in these other emerging countries, Brazil, Vietnam, Turkey, etc., they don't have that same
Yes.
opportunity.
Now, can I jump back to President Obama? Our first African American president of the United States of America visited Africa for one day in his whole first term. Is his second term, is this summit today, does it mark a trend change in the way he's operating? Is he trying to reinvent this engagement, or are the ambitions much scaled back and this is just more of a token effort?
I think it's somewhere in between. I think that it's very unfortunate that Obama has waited this long, that he has not made much of an impression on Africa so far.
But I thought he couldn't do anything. You were coming out of the recession in his first term. You're an African-American president. If he was cavorting around Africa whilst people are losing their jobs in Middle America, it wouldn't have played well.
Except unless if you make the case that, engaging Africa vigorously is a way
Yes.
to make money for America, which
Yeah.
is the case. I think that the American political system has been timid and unimaginative about Africa.
Yes.
And has, as I've said many times, has often only been able to think of Africa in security terms and humanitarian terms. It's
Yes.
for a leader to redefine that and to say,
Yes.
Africa is 1 billion people today, 2 billion people by 2050, 3 billion people by 2000. It's got the fastest growing economies in the world. It's got the fastest growing middle class in the world. It's the fastest urbanizing part of the world.
Yes.
We need to be in Africa, not because we're good people, because we
Yes.
want to take care of Africa, because we want to vaccinate their children or, do other sorts of, humanitarian things, but because this is where the opportunity is for the future. Obama has to, any leader has to make this happen, has to be able to make the argument, has to be able to be the piston that's going to push this through. Obama has waited to the second year of his second term, well into the second year of his second term, and into the month of August, which in Washington D.C. is known as the silly season. That's when nothing important happens.
Yes.
This is when, unfortunately, Obama has scheduled this thing. Now, I don't mean to say that it's meaningless,
Yes.
but this too is a kind of a lost opportunity. Obama is entering the last 2 years of his presidency, which are known typically as a lame duck period. He's already, fairly down in the polls and has
Yes.
a very difficult relationship with Congress. How far is he going to be able to? He's waited. Here's a guy who you could argue had a historic opportunity given
Yes.
his background with Africa, and he's waited this long to really engage with Africa.
And by contrast, Xi Jinping's first trip abroad ended up in Africa.
So the Chinese have a rule that says every year,
Yes.
either the Chinese president or the Chinese premier has to go to Africa.
My goodness.
Every year, a certain number of Chinese cabinet officials have to go to Africa. If you go back to Jiang Zemin's going out policy in 1996, you can plot this on a chart. The Chinese have been consistent at the highest level, sending presidential, prime ministerial, and cabinet level missions to Africa every single year. That's how you demonstrate. That's called servicing the relationship.
Wow.
That's how you demonstrate a commitment and a sense of priority to something. The United States has not shown an ability to do this, and that's why you see in this Obama summit, and I don't want to be totally down on it. I
Yes.
think that it's good that part of the role here of the president is saying, we don't need to be embarrassed about promoting business in Africa. We want our businesses to do well in Africa too. There's an argument that this is good for Africa as well as being good for the United States, right? But the reason why a summit like this has to sort of be an across-the-board, touch every issue. I've been amused on Twitter to have people argue in the last week or two that either this is or this should be about health, or this is or should be about education, or it is or it should be about energy, or it is or it should be about human rights, or it is or it should be about term limits or democracy or one thing or another. The reason why a summit like this has to be about everything and
Yes.
try to satisfy everyone is because the relationships are not being serviced. In other words, if you had sustained high level, it doesn't have to be the president or vice
Yes.
president every year coming to Africa like the Chinese, but if you had a much more significant kind of high level sustained diplomatic engagement with the continent, you could have you could disaggregate these issues, and you could have an economic summit that was really about business and economy, and a few months later or the next year or whenever you could have a democracy summit and a human rights summit and a healthcare summit and an energy summit, et cetera, et cetera. They don't all have to be summits, but you can focus your attention on particular issues and really move the agenda in pointed ways in specific areas without having to have this great kind of blur that's taking place with, I fear, with this Obama summit, where they feel like they have to, everything's got to be touched upon, which essentially means that in the end, almost nothing really becomes prioritized.
Howard French, thank you so very much. It was
Thank you,
really
Ali
a
Khan.
privilege. I've been following you for more than a year, even longer.
Couple of years.
Couple of years actually, and so it feels it's great to meet somebody offline when you follow them so closely. And I really urge you to read Howard's book. It's called China's Second Continent. I read it in one afternoon sitting, and my wife complained that I was ignoring her, but I said I had to. And it really was really remarkable and a wonderful journey through the continent at the grassroots, riding on public transport to get to A to B, going to the most extraordinary places, and a love of Africa, which came through in so many different ways, which I really appreciated. And again, please, if you haven't got it yet, go and get it. And the place to get it is probably Yaya Center if you're in Nairobi. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Howard.
Ali Khan.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
No, it was mine, all mine.